Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with Lee Kravetz. Lee is author of the acclaimed nonfiction Strange Contagion and SuperSurvivors. He has written for print and television, including the New York Times, the New York Magazine, The Atlantic, Psychology Today, The Daily Beast, the San Francisco Chronicle, and PBS. Lee is a member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto, the Castro Writers Co-op, as well as a founding member of LitCamp, a founding board member of LitCamp. Lee's new book and the subject of our talk today is a work of fiction, his novel, The Last Confessions of Sylvia P. Kirkus Reviews called the book, quote, a compelling literary mystery, while Publishers Weekly said that Lee, quote, makes an engrossing fiction debut and reveals himself to be a fine novelist. I can attest to that. I absolutely love this book. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It is great to have you. So let's just start off with the most obvious question. Can you tell us a little bit about just kind of the high level what the book is about?
Yeah, so the book it's really in some ways about Sylvia Plath and how she came to, be inspired to write The Bell Jar, which is, this very famous novel that she wrote right before her death, actually. But it's also about the impact of the book. And so we follow three different women in three different eras and how their interactions with Sylvia sort of propelled her and inspired her to write the book. And also how the book and Sylvia Plath inspired them and changed them throughout their lives.
Okay. Can you tell, I assume most of the listeners and viewers are probably already familiar with Sylvia Plath. I mean, she's huge, but for those who might not be, can you just sort of contextualize her, when was she alive? When was she writing? Tell us a little bit more about her writing, also just kind of in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sylvia Plath is primarily known as a poet, and she kind of came about in the mid 50s to early 60s, and she died in 1963. And one of the things that I fell in love with was she was one of sort of the founders of this new movement of poetry. Called Confessional Poetry. Confessional poets all sort of started out around that time, kind of came of age in the early 1960s to 1963, 1964, 1965. And this form of poetry was just radically different from so many different kinds of poetry that was already sort of out there. At the time, there were different movements of poetry. I have a list of it here because there's just so many of them. But there were surrealists, there were the romantics, there were the metaphysical poets, the graveyard poets. But confessional poetry was really the poetry of one's thoughts and feelings. We think about poetry today as being raw and real about oneself and autobiographical. It wasn't always that way. And Sylvia and her cohort, who created this sort of confessional poetry movement, they brought that to the forefront, and it changed literature forever. Right. And I'll tell you, when I started reading, her story, that's the thing that really grabbed me. And of course, then she wrote The Bell Jar, which, is sort of a semi-autobiographical novel about her experience as a young woman. She had she was bipolar, and we really sort of follow her over the course of basically 6 or 7 months, having a manic breakdown and being sent to a mental asylum for some time. And so that's really what The Bell Jar is all about.
Right. So why choose Sylvia and The Bell Jar as the basis of a novel?
One of the things I loved about this was, going back to confessional poetry really started not in a university, not in a classroom, and not, in a really, metropolitan city where, a lot of these sort of other movements started, but they started in a mental hospital. They started in McLean Hospital, right outside of Boston. I mean, to think about that, it's a literary movement that started in padded rooms with people who were, undergoing insulin shock therapy and electroshock therapy and Freudian sort of, therapies. And there was something so beautiful and intriguing about art springing from such, low places. And I thought, gosh, wouldn't that be fascinating to meet the people who inspired this? Was it a therapist that inspired Sylvia to do this? Was it were other writers that were there, other patients that were there? Was it the setting? What was it that, because Sylvia went into, in real life, Sylvia Plath went to McLean Hospital, and she had a psychiatrist who she was close with through the rest of her life, named Ruth Barnhouse. So
Dr. Ruth.
Dr. Ruth. And what did Dr. Ruth Barnhouse actually do to influence and change Sylvia? Because when she got Sylvia was admitted to the hospital, and she couldn't read, she couldn't write, she was completely disabled. She was so manic. And Dr. Barnhouse sort of built her back up, taught her to read again, taught her to write again, taught her to express her feelings. I was like, wow, this is just absolutely stunning. And that was
Right.
the germ of the book.
Well, and you are, or you were, I'm not sure which, a psychotherapist. So this is already sort of your background. So I would assume that was part of the attraction as well, that you already have a background in this area.
It's a really great question. So yes, so I did have a background in it. The story actually sort of, the whole seed of this novel really started, believe it or not, in a mental hospital. As we all do when we're trying to become writers and artists, and we're sort of struggling, we take funny jobs. And one of my funny jobs somehow found me at one point moving into the field of psychotherapy. I needed a job, and something that I felt like I could do well, because writing wasn't working. And at one point I found myself working at a mental hospital here in Northern California. And it turned out to be the exact same mental hospital that Ken Kesey worked at when he started writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in the ward right next to the old ward that he was in. And when you walk in, there was, for the patients, there was like a library so that the patients could pick books out. And this was not a very pretty library. It wasn't a very pretty mental ward, but it was there, and I'd see it every day. And on my lunch break, I'd always go and pick up books just to read. And the bell jar was there, and I had read it before, but now I was reading it in a new context. I was like, this is something special.
Yeah. Wow. what a discovery to find the bell jar in a mental institution.
Yeah. No kidding.
A couple questions that sort of about craft, because like I said in your bio, your first two books were nonfiction. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to jump to fiction? Because this is another subject. You could have written about Sylvia's life. You could have written a nonfiction work. And given that that's your background, why did you decide, I want to fictionalize this? I want to jump to fiction for this book.
With nonfiction, all my nonfiction was all narrative based. And so I think in my heart, I've always sort of wanted to be that novelist, and, my first book, I really gravitated toward the narrative of people going through trauma and recovering from trauma and changing their life as a result of trauma. And then my second book, nonfiction, was all about a town that was really undergoing sort of a major trauma. And I was, just really pulled to the characters and the arcs of these folks. And it sort of dawned on me, like, fiction is where my heart's always been. It's where I needed to go. And so I called my agent and I said, I'm thinking about writing a novel. And he laughed at me and said, please don't write a novel.
Oh, no.
And I said, no. I know. And my heart sort of dropped a little bit. And I said, well, why? And he goes, every nonfiction writer wants to be a novelist. And, it usually does not go well. Mm-hmm. I said, okay. And I said, just give me a chance, man. Give me a chance. And so I sent him the first draft about a year later. And all of a sudden his tone changed. And he said, okay, but let's start building this thing up, because I see where you're going here. And over the course of 2 more years, the novel became what it is now. And it's, it's surprising. It's based on obviously a real story, but it's also, I'm able to really get into the heart and souls and minds of people in a way that nonfiction wouldn't allow.
Right. A personal question. I'm curious. So when your agent told you, wait, don't do this, and your agent has already shepherded your career, and this is someone in whom you presumably have a lot of trust, and they know your abilities, they know your writing style, they just know a lot about you. So what was it that made you say, and kind of find the strength and the courage to say, you know what, love you, appreciate your input, but I think I'm going to do this anyway.
I think part of it is insanity. I honestly,
which goes well with a lot of the
what I'm
themes of
writing
what we're
about.
talking about. Right.
Someone asked me one time if art and creativity and mental illness go hand in hand, and the research shows it doesn't, except in one way. When you're writing, when you're in the flow, that is very much a form of mania. And I was really in the flow at that point. I knew that this novel could be something. I knew that the story was important, not because from anything that it wasn't from me. I just thought that the story itself had never been told. And I thought that, if I could sort of get in there, I might be able to do something nobody has done with this particular story. And so, I basically, I told my agent, I said, listen, I'll tell you what, I'm going to work on this novel, but I'm also going to work on some nonfiction stuff too. And when the time comes, I will give you both, and you tell me which one I should go for.
Interesting. So you found a compromise, a way to keep going nonetheless, and then you were able to sell them on it ultimately. And
oh yeah, totally. He took a look at the nonfiction and was like, "You're not even trying." And I said,
right.
Like,
Sorry, was it that transparent?
Yeah. Seriously, I think, I won't even go into it, but let me just put it to you this way. It involved aliens. Like, this is nonfiction, a proposal that involved aliens and people working toward living forever.
Well, that's actually pretty hot right now, though, right? I mean, that is actually going on. There is a big field of people trying to live forever, right? So
there are a ton of them, and more power to them, truly. But the way I presented it was, let me tell the story of these 5 crackpots, and you tell me what you think, and then I'll give you this novel, and you tell me what you think. And he came back to me and was like, "We're putting the nonfiction aside."
Right. Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Okay, just one more question along those lines with regards to fiction versus nonfiction. I'm just curious, making that jump to fiction, were there any particular challenges that stand out, given that the last 2 books were nonfiction?
I didn't really see a lot of challenges. I mean, I think that just was sort of a testament to sort of where my head was at. The only challenge that I had was that there's no guardrails. With nonfiction, you have the truth to sort of guide your way. And when I was writing the 3rd draft of this book, I realized that I had to let go of a lot of the fact, the guardrails, the nonfiction stuff that was guiding the fiction. I had to let that go because it was holding me back way too much. There's a character, one of the primary characters is a character named Boston Rhodes, and she's based on a number of people, sort of like an amalgamation of them, but one in particular. And I was using that the real person at one point as a model for this, and I realized I couldn't, because it was just holding the story back way too much. So the minute I was able to let go of the guardrails, let my imagination sort of take me where I needed to go, then all of a sudden the novel really became something very, very different, much deeper, and surprisingly so.
Right. So you've mentioned, so there's sort of 4 main characters. So there's Sylvia, but then you also tell the story, and you've mentioned 2 of the narrators. So 2 of the narrators, but they're actually 3 women who narrate first person the story, like you said, different times, different places. So can you mentioned Dr. Barnhouse, you just mentioned Boston Rhodes, and can you tell us about, I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Esty.
Okay.
Esty.
Right. So maybe just tell us about Esty as well.
Right. So Esty's storyline takes place in sort of the present. Boston Rhodes's story takes place sort of in the middle. It's 1962-ish, 1960, 1962. And Dr. Ruth Barnhouse, who's Sylvia's therapist in the mental hospital, it's 1953. So you got 3 different eras. Esty, she is a curator at an auction house. It's a small auction house in Boston. She spent her whole life curating objects and items. She loves it. And throughout the book, you really sort of dive into all these sort of special things that she's discovered over her lifetime. And when we meet her, she's actually nearing retirement. She's on her way out of this auction house. And when these 2 guys, these brothers, these sort of blue collar brothers who flip houses, show up one day with a box, and they found this lockbox in this house that they've tried to flip, and when they open it, they find 3 notebooks, and they want to know if they're worth anything because they were obviously hidden in this attic in a really sort of suspicious way. And so Esty takes a look at it, and she's looking through it, and she very quickly realizes that these might be something special after all, that somebody has deliberately transposed the bell jar, the novel The Bell Jar, into these notebooks. And the more she looks, the more she starts to suspect that these might actually be the original authentic notebooks that Sylvia Plath wrote her novel in.
Right.
And that sort of launches her journey into figuring out, well, are they real? And if so, how the heck did they wind up in a random attic in South Boston?
Right, which ends up being a complicated, engrossing tale that goes basically throughout the book. What about the fact, so all 4 of these characters, these main characters, are women.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like for you, writing from the perspective of particularly 3 first-person narrators who were women?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit thorny to sort of talk about this sort of stuff, so I'm glad you're bringing it up.
Right.
And it's
Because there's
almost
a lot of sensitivity right now about, affluent
Mhm.
white women writing about Latinx immigrant experience, or straight actors doing LGBT
Absolutely.
roles, that sort of thing. And yet we are creatives, and we do put ourselves into. So how did you navigate that?
So, it's not easy, and it takes a lot of tinkering and a lot of back and forth and trying to get it right. So first things first, even when I was talking to my agent about this, I was saying, there's got to be some sensitivity here because, as people can see, I'm a white, male, writer. How am I going to be writing with authenticity and sensitivity about, about women, about people's lives that are very, very different from my own? So part of it was, going into this with that sort of understanding and that sort of awareness. And also part of it is doing the work. I mean, really doing the work. So for instance, I read every journal published by each of these women, or the people who made up these women.
Right.
And there are some wonderfully detailed journals that have come out, and they're and there are actually times when I would take my phone and dictate an orate into my phone in their voices. So you can actually, you can actually go into my recorder and hear me speaking in a voice, in a tone that emulates very much, almost like method acting,
Right.
who these people are and then who they became. And part of this is also, you have to understand that, as you're a professional, you're supposed to really get into the hearts and souls of these characters. If I've represented anybody badly, that is 1000% on me, without a doubt, right? But then once you get to a place where you think it's right, but you're not sure, that's when I went to my writing group, which is I would say like 99% women.
Right.
Not that they represent all voices or thoughts and feelings about women, but there was a good sort of litmus test. And then I sort of, then the last component of this was sort of diving into my own sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of creative side, my emotional attunement side, all of those sorts of things. And so that you put that together and you move forward and you hope that you get it right.
Right.
So,
well, in my humble opinion, you definitely got it right. Like I said, I did not want to put this book down. And we're going to talk about some of the other reasons I didn't want to put it down. But I just mentioned, we just talked about the 3 women narrators. Let's just talk about the fact that you chose 3 narrators. Can you tell me about that choice and the challenges of weaving those 3 together in a way that works?
And so I love that question. And I'll tell you, literally from the day that I sat down to work on this, the very first day, it was always 3 narrators.
Really?
Always.
How did you know that from the very beginning?
Part of it was I couldn't figure out where to start. Did I do it from the perspective of her therapist? Did I do it from the perspective of her literary rival? Or do I do it from her perspective from the perspective of somebody who discovers this in modern times? And then I was like, you know what? I think this story is big enough that it needs all three. And gosh, at that point, I knew that I was going to have a major project on my hands because, as you know, and anybody who reads the book, I've always sort of described it as clockwork. When you open up the book, every scene has to work perfectly with the next scene and work perfectly with the scene before, after that. And not only that, it goes backward in time. So, backward and forward in time. So every scene that we see has to sort of inform the next scene and inform the next scene. And I just knew that in order for this to really, really work, they all had to work in perfect harmony. And so that was the biggest challenge, because you get to a point as a writer, you write yourself into a corner and you don't know where to go. And so once you start making major changes, you realize, oh my God, this cascades and hits all the other storylines. And now I've got to change all of them. And so they were, each storyline started informing the next and then informing me as the writer. And I'll tell you that, yeah, that's really it.
I'm overwhelmed just listening to it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's insane. It's insane.
Did you storyboard it? I mean, did you?
Yeah. I did, but I did it in my sort of non-organizational way. I have a picture somewhere of, I put each scene and each story point on a scrap of paper.
Yeah.
It literally tore up. And I got my living room table and I did like a whole map of it. And then I took a picture of it. And that was what I used. I mean, there were like, at one point, I think there were 300 little scraps of paper in different rows, and I'd have to move them around to get it.
I believe it. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so Boston and, I'm sorry, Esty, is that what we said? Yep. Esty, right? Mm-hmm. Boston and Esty are fictional characters. Mm-hmm. Sylvia, Dr. Barnhouse, a few others or several others, Robert Lowell in the book, mm-hmm. are historical figures, people who actually lived. A key part of the story is this rivalry between the fictional Boston Rhodes and real life Sylvia Plath. So can you tell me a little bit about your decision to create this fictional rivalry as one of the main threads to the story?
Yeah. So Boston Rhodes, if you read the novel, when you read the novel, is a character who is a little bit older than Sylvia when we meet her. She's probably in her late 20s, early 30s, and Sylvia is in her sort of mid 20s at this point. And Boston is this character who has been bad at everything that she tries. And she sees herself as a major failure in life, which of course is not true, but from her sort of skewed perspective, she just is not good at anything. She's not good at mothering, in her opinion. She's not good at being a wife, in her opinion. She's not good at being a daughter, in her opinion. And then one day, in the middle of sort of a manic moment in her life, she discovers sonnets and she discovers poetry. And lo and behold, she is good. Like, she is really good. And she enrolls in Robert Lowell's famous sort of poetry workshop at Boston University. And she's doing really, really, really well. And she's going to take the crown, right? She's going to go far until Sylvia Plath shows up and blows her out of the water. So this rivalry begins. I knew that there had to be a character like Boston Rhodes. And I knew that there had to be somebody who saw Sylvia not only for her beauty, but as a challenge, right? There was a person in real life who sort of fit this mold. And it's Anne Sexton. Anne Sexton was a contemporary of Sylvia's, famously in Robert Lowell's workshop as well. And they actually did, if you read Anne Sexton's journals, which I did, you see, and even Sylvia's journals, they talk about each other in loving terms, but there was absolutely a rivalry there. Mm-hmm. And they needed each other. I mean, even Anne Sexton even wrote about Sylvia, and Sylvia wrote about Anne, in their poetry. And they drove each other and they prompted each other, and it was this beautiful thing. But I also knew that I couldn't have Anne Sexton be the rival here, because Boston Rhodes goes much farther in her rivalry. She takes it to an extreme. So at one point I realized, okay, I can model people after real life, but not necessarily make them the real people. At the same time, we also have real characters, right? we have, Robert Lowell, we have all the people in the poetry class, you have Sylvia Plath herself. And so what I tried to do in in those cases is almost have stories that were adjacent to these characters,
Mm-hmm.
with one exception. And that was Dr. Ruth Barnhouse. Dr. Ruth Barnhouse is somebody who is fascinating. She was the therapist that received Sylvia Plath when she was in the hospital.
And this is a real life person as well, right?
Real life person. And
right.
if you read the bell jar, she actually makes an appearance in the bell jar. She plays Dr. Nolan,
right,
in the bell jar. And you see that Dr. Nolan is sort of the hero of the bell jar. She really sort of helps Sylvia do her thing and become who she is. And so I knew that she had to be in there. There is not a lot of research on who Dr. Barnhouse was. There's some. We know that she was a psychiatrist. We know that she was there. We know that who she got married to. We know that she had a couple of kids. We know that there was a tragedy in her life. And ultimately, we know that she left psychiatry and became a priest, actually, in Dallas. And she died in her 90s. But, it's a fascinating story. But
right.
I was like, so what can I do? What can I invent? What can I make it so that makes her a compelling, real life character, but also has some fictional elements as well in there. And so that's where the balance really came into play.
What about creating Sylvia herself as a character? I mean, maybe that was a little, you were just talking about how with Dr. Barnhouse, there wasn't that much information. Sylvia, there's so much information. So was that a little easier in a sense, given the information? No, you're shaking your head. No.
Oh,
tell
God,
us
no.
about that.
No. That actually, that was the holy grail. When I wrote in Sylvia's voice or had her in dialogue, I tread very carefully, very, very carefully, because you had to capture her voice. You had to capture her state of mind. And she was absolutely, she was somebody I wanted to take care of and just protect. And, when you're writing, you can't really protect your characters. So I had to sort of play a little bit of a balance there, but I also had to be honest and true. And so when you see Sylvia, and when she appears in this book, in each of the eras that she appears in, they aren't pleasant scenes. There's some that are very, graphic and emotionally sort of wrought. And we see her in some very ugly places, in
right.
mean places. And so I had to do that with authenticity and honesty as the best I could. But I was very scared to write her.
Yeah. So, we talked about how, I don't know if we talked about how her poetry addresses her mental health issues and struggles, the bell jar. We talked about how that talks about how that tackles those subjects. And of course, in real life, again, she ends up committing suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a little bit more about how her mental health struggles informed both her writing and also your book?
Well, I knew, look, I mean, coming from a background in psychology, I know what bipolar looks like. When I was going through my training, I'd be in session with people who would actually be in full-blown crisis mode, going into manic sort of moments. So I knew what that looked like. I know what the research shows. I know what it, so I've been there, but I've also seen it. So I knew that when I was writing this book, I wanted the depictions of mental illness to be done with as much care as I was taking with the characters who are real life characters as well. So that authenticity needed to be there, but it couldn't read like a medical book. So how do we do that? You can't list the symptoms, right? That's awful. We all know that. So the trick there was actually turning off the nonfiction brain, going into the fiction brain, which is showing, not telling, right?
Right.
So you show the rule, right? So you show how Sylvia is in these moments, and then you show how the characters around them are responding to it, and without ever once saying bipolar mania, or without ever once saying manic depression, which is what they called it back then. It's always done in scene. It's always done in show. And so that's what really sort of informed me. Once again, it's about taking the guardrails off and just sort of like, well, what does somebody in major crisis look like?
Right.
And that was it.
So Boston, with regards to Sylvia, she's thinking about Sylvia, and she says, quote, Sylvia presented herself as a strong and confident woman, an independent woman, but beneath all that sheen and polish Sylvia was desperate for love.
Mhm.
Is that just Boston talking, or do you think that largely explains a lot, or is that an oversimplification? Is that too simple, or do you think that's a key root to her mental health struggles, what she was going through?
So Boston Rose is a very unreliable narrator. I mean, from page one, she's just completely bonkers when it comes to the way that she sees the world. But in that moment, she sees Sylvia for exactly who she is. And Sylvia talks about it, all the journals that Ruth Barnhouse kept, all the notes that came out. And if you read the bell jar line by line, take it apart, that is it. That is Sylvia in a nutshell. And as an artist, I think we all sort of feel that way, in some ways, right? It's about
It's a human.
loved, right? It's about being loved. It's all about being loved. Sylvia needed it more than anybody. Her father had died when she was young. Her mother was very overpowering and what's the word?
Overprotective.
Oh, thank you.
Overbearing.
Overprotective, all of that, overparenting, all of that. And it really left Sylvia in a place of being completely vulnerable. So by the time that she really started, suffering from manic depression, which 17, 18 years old, maybe even before that, she was in a place where she actually really needed love that she wasn't receiving. And then it just became deeper and deeper and deeper. And if you read her poetry and you read the bell jar and you look at her letters back and forth between her and Ruth Barnhouse and Snodgrass and Lowell and all of these sort of poets that were contemporaries of her at the time, it is all about love. It's about this desperate, deep need to be loved and to find love and to curate that love. And it's actually, famously, when Sylvia dies at the age of 30, it's because she feels completely abandoned by everybody, from her mother to her therapist, to her husband. Exactly, right? Who makes an appearance in this, obviously. And so that's really it.
Right. Is it safe to assume that, because again, we're talking about the 50s and 60s, is it safe to assume that, mental health issues weren't talked about as nearly, remotely as openly as they are today? Did the bell jar and did also the work of the confessional poets, is it safe to assume that that had a big impact on us as a society starting to talk about these things, or were they sort of ahead of their time and that didn't come until later?
So confessional poetry hit big. It hit really big because it was shocking, because it was saying all of these things that everybody was feeling and thinking, but nobody was saying. And so that the poetry movement was big, and there was of course a huge pushback. There's a little hint of that with that we talk about with Robert Frost in one of the opening scenes of the novel dislikes confessional poetry so much that he lights himself on fire.
Right. Is that true? Did that happen?
That actually did happen.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, there was a big pushback. But so poetry had much more of an impact, and we were starting to talk about it more. And you see all these sort of magazines at that time are talking about it also. Mademoiselle, Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, all of a sudden start talking about these sorts of things, these sort of realistic sort of depictions of what, women and people in general are starting to, they're talking about things that they never talk about, whether it's abortion, whether it's masturbation, whether it's about sex, whether it's about hating being parents. These are all the things that we talk about in therapy today. The vicissitudes of life that you keep quiet, you don't talk about. The bell jar comes out, though. When the bell jar comes out, nobody's talking about the bell jar. When the bell jar comes out, it sells less than 1,000 copies. It's not printed in the United States. It's so personal to Sylvia that she uses a pen name because she doesn't want the people that she's, thinly veiled in her novel to know that it's about her or them. And it's not for about 5 or 6 years later that all of a sudden, and this is well after Sylvia's dead, that the bell jar becomes the phenomenon that we all know today.
And how and why did that happen? How did it go from near obscurity to?
Part of it was right after she died, her poetry became really big. So she was known before her death. After her death, her poetry books in her collection started coming out. She got a bigger and bigger and bigger following. And she became this world-renowned poet. And Confessional Poetry was the thing. And Sexton wins the Pulitzer Prize for poetry about, using confessional poetry. It has arrived. And at that point, the bell jar is reintroduced as, by the way, Sylvia also wrote this novel. And that was when it just took off. And it was printed by HarperCollins. It was picked up in the United States. And then boom. And to this day, it's one of the biggest sellers still.
Right. I want to jump back to something you talked about at the beginning of our conversation that I think is really, really relevant to this conversation and to the book. And it's that notion, again, that you touched on earlier, this sort of common belief that we've had historically, or at least for a long time, that there's a correlation between quote unquote craziness and creativity. Because you do say, so you have a character in the book called the Mad Poet. And he says, quote, "A mild, disinhibiting quality of mania is like mineral spirits to an artist's oil paints. It loosens the imaginative thought." And Boston Rhodes, like you said, she's all over the place. And so can you talk a little bit more about that notion? I mean, because you said interestingly earlier, that the evidence is that that's not true. So can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, you got it. So common sense sort of shows us that there's some sort of correlation between creativity and madness. If you look, I mean, some of the greatest artists on the planet throughout history have been crazy. And I do think that there's an inhibition, an ability to look past the day-to-day, constraints and frameworks of our world to see things in a way that nobody else does. Does that mean that you're suddenly going to have the ability to show it? No. But for people who have an artistic sort of disposition, it can work really well, and it works really, really well. So if you look at just the numbers and the stats and all that stuff, there really isn't, though, a real one-to-one correlation. And I did say that when we're writing and we're painting and we're creating, we're in a state of mania. But there is one diagnosis. There's one diagnosis where creativity and mania or psychological distress has a correlation, and it's bipolar. Bipolar disorder, for some reason, there does seem to be a correlation between the two. Now, and if you look at the poets who started confessional poetry and led confessional poetry all the way through, they all had one thing in common. They all had bipolar mania. All of them. Every single one.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why that's the case, or is that the big question?
That is a big question. I mean, look, part of it is, okay, so mania is this idea that we become sort of hyper, right? And we feel and taste everything, and all sort of constraints disappear. If you want to think about what mania really looks like when somebody is fully in a manic state with bipolar disorder, think of Charlie Sheen. When Charlie Sheen was just, on a drug-fueled, sort of crusade a couple of years ago, lots of drugs, lots of sex, lots of just sort of ramblings. I drink tiger blood, that sort of like this sort of bombastic things. That is creativity. That's poetry. That is tapping something that it is impossible to tamp down. And I think that there's something about that state, being in that state, that shocks people, that allows us to see things that other people don't, to see colors in ways that other people don't. I mean, if you ever find yourself in a room with somebody who's going through a manic, experience, it is, once you get past the fear and the reality of the scary situation, it is absolutely fascinating to listen to the tangential connections that people make. It really is poetry.
Yeah, and you know what I'm thinking of? I don't know. Did you watch Homeland?
I
Did you watch
haven't
The
watched
Homeland?
it. No.
Because she's manic, and I just watched it recently, even though it came out years and years ago. I just watched it recently, but exactly what you're describing, you might find it interesting. But that's because the main character, the protagonist, played by Claire Danes, she's manic, and when she's in these situations where she needs to, basically solve a mystery or whatever, everything's coming together, and everyone thinks she's quote unquote crazy, that she's mad. But then when she comes down and people look at what she's just done, they realize, oh my God, she was able to make all these connections that those of us who are just sort of in a normal, healthy mental state couldn't even see. And we missed it. She actually got it because she went into this different state where she had these different sort of almost faculties, right?
Well, there's also another, I mean, to that point, there's actually another very real component to this. When you're manic, you don't sleep. You literally get more hours in your day and do more than anybody else can in that period of time. When you're truly manic, you are not sleeping for 4 days solid. That means that yes, you're bonkers, but you also have more time and energy to sort of throw into the art and just sort of create. That, I think, is something that any creative who's been in the flow before can attest to. You don't sleep. You just you pour in. You find more hours in the day to do more, and that, I think, is probably the key to real artistic sort of success in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think when you're in the flow, if you can stay there, as long as you can stay there, it's only going to benefit your work and get you to the finish line. I remember when I was finishing my novel, staying up till 4 or 5, just because I was just repeatedly, I wasn't necessarily manic, or I don't know, maybe I was, but I was just in the flow so much that I wasn't tired. I would eventually just have to face the fact, okay, it's 5 a.m.
We got to do something, right?
Well,
right.
I want to function tomorrow. But I didn't want to stop it, because I didn't have anything else going on at the time. I was on a retreat, I was in my own sort of retreat. So I had created that space to just let happen what needed to happen. And so I could stay up till 4 or 5. But yeah, when we're in the flow,
that's it, man. It's, you just want to keep on going. You have that dopamine rush when you're working. Well, if you're in a manic state, it's pure dopamine.
Right.
It's pure dopamine, and you never want to come down. Right. And then of course you do, and you crash, and that's what wants you in.
Then you realize there's no such thing as a free lunch.
That's exactly it. That's when you wind up in the mental hospital with Sylvia Plath.
Right. So speaking of the mental hospital with Sylvia Plath, I want to ask you about something that Dr. Barnhouse, her doctor, said. Again, she was a psychotherapist. She, in addition to being Sylvia's psychotherapist, she also was working, and this is sort of a sub-thread in the novel, she's working to improve the treatments that their patients are giving in this institution. And she said something that I found really interesting, given that she is a psychotherapist and given her perspective. She said, quote, and this is, she's reflecting on this is later in the book, and she's reflecting on the potential value of the diaries themselves. And she says, quote, let me just say, insight does not get you far in this world. Yeah. Insight only keeps you locked in the past with memories and with ghosts. So insight only keeps you locked in the past. Well, I found that really interesting because, again, she is a psychotherapist, and so much of what most of us know about psychotherapy is this notion that, well, we've got to go back to the past because a lot of issues we may have brought with us to adulthood are rooted in our childhood. We need to go confront them, resolve them, work through them. And yet here we have a psychotherapist who's saying you can also get locked in the past. So can you speak to me about that sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. Man, you did some wonderful research here and picked out that line is actually really critical, simply because when Ruth Barnhouse was actually practicing psychology in 1952, 1953, there was a major split in the practice of psychology. Major split. You had the people who were Freudians, psychodynamic theory. We're going to get a little nitty gritty here, but these are the people who said it's all about the past. It's all about past relationships, past trauma. We got to go back, resolve, and then we're going to come bring it to the present. And we're going to identify, cycles that are problematic. We're going to fix those cycles in the past, those relationships, bring it to the present, and you will be miraculously cured.
Integrated.
That's great. That's exactly right. You'll be an integrated human being, healthy, happy, go on your life. But at that time, when Dr. Barnhouse came in, there was a major pushback against Freudian therapy, Freudian psychology. And it became less about the past. The past doesn't matter. The past doesn't matter. And it's hard to wrap your head around, but it's the past doesn't matter. You can't go back and change the past. You can't, you have to give up on the hope that the past can be any different. There's really nothing you can do. So what are you left with? You're left with the stuff that's happening now. The symptoms, the thinking, the feeling, the behaviors that you're doing. It's very present. It doesn't matter where they came from. If you get a headache, it doesn't matter why you got the headache. You just want to take care of the symptoms now. Mm-hmm. Take some Advil, you're fine. That became the way forward for psychotherapy moving forward. And to this day, that is actually psychodynamic theory and therapy is still very much, a well-practiced therapy. And it's good, it works. But so does working and living in the present, being very present, very mindful of where you're at and dealing with the symptoms now. The problem with staying in the past is that it can lock you in there. And sometimes we get stuck
there.
Yeah.
Right. But that's interesting though, that, you sort of conclude that there's a place for both. Mm-hmm. It's just that we don't want to get stuck there. If we're going to go visit for a particular purpose and we can sort of achieve that aim and come back, maybe it's productive as long as we don't get stuck there.
Totally. Without giving too much away, that, the hospital needs to adapt. The therapies need to adapt because we see very clearly why the old theories and the old practices stopped working at this hospital. There's some really, bad things that happen there. And, so this, and one of the reasons Barnhouse is sort of, rejected by all the staff at this hospital is because she brings in this whole new modality, which was at the time completely radical as confessional poetry was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people don't like change. So let's move briefly from the sort of mental to the physical world, to the very physical, and I mean specifically to objects, because there are a couple themes that kind of run throughout that also caught my eye that I just wanted to ask you about because I found them interesting. One is, first of all, like I said, objects. The whole book is centered around three objects, right? The notebooks, the diaries. So right off the bat, we're already sort of thinking in those terms. But throughout the book, though, or in addition, rather, there's a lot of ruminations on objects and our relationships with objects, the importance, the value we give to objects. Just a few examples. Esty is a curator of objects, like you said. So that's kind of her life, again, is built around objects. She says, quote, "Over the years, I have forged a kinship with many objects. Watching them leave the auction house is tantamount to a repetitive stress fracture of the heart." I love that. Boston says, for her, quote, "The objects my husband left behind, the clothes in his closet, his cigarettes on the reading table, the car in the garage, were no longer enough to keep me feeling close to him in his absences." And then two other quotes. I love this quote. This again is Esty. She says, quote, "The chamber I share with these notebooks possesses a somber air, but also one of wonder over the propulsive instinct of objects to wind their way back to places and people. Objects find a home the way a river deposits sand." Mm-hmm. I love that. And then the last thing I'll say is just, quote, "All objects carry a piece of those who have ever possessed them." So again, this is a recurring theme throughout the book. Can you speak to that and just our relationships with objects and how it's relevant to the story?
Well, I think that when you're dealing with like madness, sometimes we lose track of reality. It's all ether. It's all sort of in the air. And I think sometimes we need objects to sort of ground us. And I think that not only is the bell jar part, for instance, part of this novel, but the actual physical bell jar, the books themselves make an appearance. And they were the things that sort of connect us to past, present, and future. There's I sort of focus on this kaleidoscope effect that happens in the novel where basically past, present, and legacy all sort of come together. Well, the things that sort of tie those together, well, there's love, obviously, and there's emotion, but there's also the physical. There's also the physical sort of objects that sort of tie us to moments and to people. And about the last third of the book, you start to see how these objects actually physically connect each of these disparate people. A therapist who has never met Boston Rhodes, a curator who, while she collects objects, has no real, on the surface, no sort of connection to a therapist who practiced 60 years ago, and a poet who practiced years and years after that. So what are the things that sort of connect these sort of disparate people and disparate stories? Where they're objects. They're objects that move through time. And while sometimes these objects, like you said before, lock people in the past in a way that they can't get out of, like Boston Rhodes is just locked into this sort of belief that she's been, wronged. Or you got Esty, who is liberated by these objects. And by the end of the novel, truly liberates objects, it's sort of a reciprocal relationship to objects. So I think that, it's sort of it's a sort of a complicated question and a complicated answer, but I think that that's really it. It's, these objects can either liberate us or they can trap us forever. And I think that was sort of the thing I like playing with.
Right. Another theme that I found really interesting was this idea of circling back to the start. I'm going to give you a couple examples here again. Esty says, quote, "Life is poetry, its symmetry and rhythm. We return to the places where we begin." Well, and then she says that exact line later. She says, "We return to the places where we began," a second time. Likewise, Boston says, quote, "It can take so very little to return us to the person we once were."
Yeah.
Dr. Barnhouse later says that exact line. It can take so little to return us to the person we once were. So can you speak to that notion as well?
Right. So the circular nature of the characters' journeys sort of mirrors the actual circular nature of the story, the novel that we're actually reading. And I really needed that to work. I needed each of these stories to begin in a place and end in a place that's very similar, even though the characters had gone through a major journey and learned throughout the way. But again, when we meet Sylvia Plath, she's manic. She's depressed. She's in a dire state. And by the end of the novel, even though she's grown, she's back where she began. And in many ways, she never changed in that regard, right? She was never able to let go of that. Boston Rhodes, the exact same thing, right? She starts in a place of, being in a desperate state, and she ends very similarly as well. And so, and then obviously that becomes a major, once Boston Rhodes figures this out, because she knows that it doesn't take very much to knock somebody off, who they, send them back to reeling to who they were before. She uses that, and it really sort of, she weaponizes that fact. So I think that was really, really important to really show that no matter how much we change, we're always still at our core that same person.
Right. Do you not think, though, that we can break beyond that cycle?
I think we can, but the tragedy of these characters is that they can't.
They don't, and they can't.
They don't. They we watch them struggle to better themselves in every way. Ruth Barnhouse has a drug problem that really derails her, and she struggles mightily. She's probably the only one who is able to sort of claw her way out of that. Boston Rhodes, the tragedy of Boston Rhodes is watching her try and fail time and time again. And the tragedy of, Esty's past, and her present story too, is really about her sort of overcoming, the male culture, the male gaze, the bureaucracy of old school thinking. When she, in the place that she works, she's struggling mightily just to sort of get past her own pain as well of her past. And she does some pretty desperate things to get there. And it remains to be seen whether or not she actually does succeed at the end.
Right. So a couple of more sort of returning to craft questions, just because a couple other things that stood out for me. I mean, I loved the suspense in the book. And, it's not just because you've got this overarching question about and suspense and sort of mystery. Again, that's a literary mystery about, where did the diaries come from? How did they get there? Where are they going to end up? So there's that throughout the book, but there's a lot of other sort of sections where there's a lot of suspense, and it really was very effective in me as the reader wanting to find out, well, how is this going to turn out? And it wasn't just one, like I said, you sort of positioned them throughout the book. So just from a craft perspective, can you talk about writing suspense and and doing that effectively?
Well, God, that's a fun question too, isn't it? Well, so part of it, as you noted, there's three stories, and so they're happening in tandem with each other in time, even though we sort of move back and forth. So I knew that, when you're working on these sorts of stories, each scene has to have tension, but the tension has to be commensurate and parallel to the tension in the other stories as well. Otherwise, you're just all over the place. You could be reading one scene where you're at sort of the climactic sort of tension, and then the next chapter you're not, and you're at like the first beat of tension. You can't do that. So in order to effectively sort of build tension, what I had to do in this book was every scene had to be, well, if the tension's at a 5, the tension in the next storyline has to be at a 5 also.
Interesting.
And then not only that, the tension from story 2 has to be in some way sort of drawn from story 1. So they have to build on each other. And the way to do that, I mean, it was like a mathematical problem.
Yeah.
It's really, really intense. It's hard to sort of explain. And I hope I'm sort of getting it right or doing it well enough here. But the other part is, tension is really just about desire. In every scene, if there's, as I ratcheted up the tension, I had to make the desire, the need to get that desire, to reach the, that desired outcome. I need the stakes to be higher, and I need the opposition to be much stronger. So as the book continues to go on, every scene has a lot of tension. That's the hope anyway. And that the opposite, the thing that's getting in the way of each of these characters reaching their goals, whether it's something as simple as, escaping, McLean Hospital to go out for the night, to the consequences that they know are waiting for them at the other end of this. So each scene has to sort of build and build and build.
And what's fascinating to me as I listen to you describe the process, because it is somewhat formulaic in the sense that, okay, if it's happening in this storyline, then it's got to be happening here. It's got to be a 5. Like you said, it's got to be across the board. But what's fascinating to me, thinking back on my experience as a reader, is that's completely transparent. I didn't stop, even though I was trying to read very critically.
Yeah.
I didn't stop to think, oh, wait, I get it. In this chapter, the tension is mimicking the tension of what I just read. And so that's kind of fascinating. And another aspect to it is making it transparent to the reader.
You have to know. So if if you're studying, if you're talking about craft, if there are certain standards. I always say this to people that I'm teaching or sort of working with. There are rules to writing any sort of art, using any sort of art. And of course, you can break those rules once you know the rules. But the rules are there for a reason, because if you deviate from those rules too much, the story will lose all tension, will lose all sort of readability. There's no momentum. So as much as it pains me to say you have to follow a certain type of formula when you're writing a novel or any sort of book, any sort of story, in some ways you do, because if you don't, you run into major problems. So basically what I had to do with this book, if you want to get into the technical element of this, I had to write 3 novels. I had to lay them out, right? Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And then I had to line them up. And I had to do it in such a way that the stories connected at the same time. So it didn't read or feel like you're reading 3 different stories, but that they informed each other. So when you have like the opening beat of the novel, chapter, the next story is also the opening beat of that novel, and the third story is the opening beat of that novel, and then you twist them together. So they had to follow a certain sort of structure. And the thing that carries throughout is the building of tension. The building of tension is the thing that has to be sustained throughout, because if that lessens in any way, shape, or form, you're going to lose interest in the entire story, not just one thread, the entire story. So again, from a technical perspective, if you really want to get into it, I thought of it almost like a 3-pronged DNA sequence. And every single scene had to move. Every single scene had to hit the same beat within the same period of time. But then, then across time as well.
No small challenge.
Oh God, no.
and yet, like I said a couple times, clearly you pulled it off really, just masterfully, and the reviews are agreeing as well. So thank you for letting me have a sneak peek, and thanks for being here today to talk about it. When is the book out?
Book comes out March 8th, and yeah, so it's coming out pretty quickly. And you can
pre-order now, I'm guessing.
You can pre-order pretty much anywhere that books are sold. I love Amazon, but go indie. Right. And I will be appearing pretty much all over the place.
And where can people find out where you will be appearing?
Yes, so you can go to my website at www.leekravetz.com. That's KRAVETZ.com. Unlike Lenny Kravitz, you can follow me everywhere. Yeah, you can also go to the HarperCollins website, and all the dates will be there as well.
All right, Lee, thank you very much, and best of luck getting the book out into the world. I am Matthew Felix. More about me at matthewfelix.com. And I am stepping away from the mic for a while, but you can keep up with me on matthewfelix.com and, of course, on social media. And I have loved doing the podcast for the past year, and getting the opportunity to have so many great conversations like I just had with Lee. And I just want to thank everyone for listening and watching. And I also hope to see you live and in person at the conference, which has just been moved from supposed to have taken place originally last weekend, but because of the pandemic, it's now been pushed out to July 21st through the 24th here in San Francisco. You can register for that now, and we hope that you do. And we hope to see you there. And again, that is at sfwriters.org. Thanks for joining us.